Welcome, friends. I'm Mary Ann Culhane. I have the honor to serve as the 10th Dean of Creighton Law School. We are in for a treat today. One of the highlights of each year is our annual Koley Lecture, named for James L. Koley, a 1954 grad of our law school. Mr. Koley and the Koley Justin Law Firm have represented the Omaha World Herald for many years and have become involved in many First Amendment cases. When Jim Koley retired from the World Herald Board in 2004, the law firm, the World Herald Foundation, and members of the World Herald management team donated funds to do three wonderful things for the law school. First, to set up this annual lecture series dealing with the Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment. Second, to endow a professorship at the law school in constitutional law. And third, to set up a scholarship awarded annually to a second or third year law student who shows an aptitude for and interest in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I'd like first to introduce Professor Michael G. Fenner, the one and so far the only James L. Koley 54 Professor of Constitutional Law. Mike is a wonderful colleague, an expert on First Amendment rights. Besides teaching constitutional law, First Amendment, and evidence, speaking at many CLE programs, updating his book on hearsay evidence, Mike generously donates his time to local and state bar associations. This year, he is serving as chair of the House of Delegates of the Nebraska State Bar Association. Mike, would you please stand up and take a bow? This year's James L. Koley Scholarship in Constitutional Law has been awarded to Stephen G. Ranum, a third-year student. Steve hails from Minot, North Dakota. He has a degree in finance from Northern State University and worked for several years as a bank examiner. That work sparked his interest in law, and luckily for us, he headed south to Omaha and to Creighton. He has excelled in his coursework here, winning many Cali awards. Among other good things that he's done here, he did so well in last year's moot court arguments that he had to argue before Justice Scalia in the final round. What can I say except he's already faced the toughest judge he ever will? Steve, would you please stand up and be recognized? So all of us at Creighton Law School are very grateful to the Koley Justin Law Firm, the Omaha World Herald Foundation, John Gottschalk, and other Omaha World Herald managers who contributed to this wonderful triple treat, a hat trick in hockey speak, a lecture, endowed scholarship, and endowed professorship, all aimed at furthering understanding of constitutional law. Would the employees and staffers of the World Herald who might be present please stand? Guess they're keeping them all at work? How about members of the Koley Justin Law Firm? Thank you. Thank you so much. Normally, Mike Fenner might introduce the speaker of the lecture series at this time. However, this year he has ceded that honor to Professor Palma Strand of our faculty, who knew somebody who apparently helped her lure our speaker from fairly balmy Virginia to Nebraska in February. She said just a few minutes ago that she almost thought she should just leave her coat at home in Virginia, but luckily reason prevailed. Palma's own story is a fascinating one. She graduated from Stanford with a degree in civil engineering and worked in that field for several years. Finally, she saw the light and turned to the law. Went back to Stanford for her JD, then to Georgetown for an LLM. She clerked for Skelly Wright on the D.C. Circuit, and then for Justice Byron White on the U.S. Supreme Court. She taught law at Maryland and Georgetown before we were able to persuade her to join us in 2007. She teaches trust and estates, legal ethics, local government, civic organizing, and sends some of our law students into local high schools and junior highs to teach street law, and hopefully to interest more young people in careers in law. Palma's service as co-chair of our Speakers Committee this year has brought us a fine array, though somehow it always starts snowing on the days the lectures are scheduled. Palma, do you come up and introduce our speaker?
Thank you. Thanks, Marianne, Mike, Koley, Jessen. Congratulations to Steve, and thank you to Hattie Rupert and Kelly Anders and all the others who have been part of putting the event together. Dahlia Lithwick, our speaker, our lecturer for today. So there's the obvious. She's the senior editor at Slate, where she writes the column Supreme Court Dispatches and covers legal issues more generally. Slate is also where she made her first mark 10 years ago, but her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, Newsweek, NPR, CNN, New Republic. But beyond the obvious, I just want to say a couple of things about why when Sean Watts and I, who were assigned to be co-chairs of the Speakers and Programs Committee, sat down and said, you know, who's on our list to try to get? Hers was among the first names. In fact, it might have been the first name that I came up with. So, not being of the online generation, I came kind of late to Slate. And I first really plugged into Ms. Lithwick's work the end of the 2006 term with the breakfast table conversation with former Solicitor General Walter Dellinger, the term that the Hamdan case came down. And you all will remember the Hamdan case as the case in which the Supreme Court curtailed kind of free-floating presidential power with respect to military commissions. Their discussion of Hamdan gave me, and actually still gives me, chills when I think about it, especially Walter Dellinger's assertion that, and I'm quoting, Hamdan was simply the most important decision on presidential power and the rule of law ever. Ever. This wasn't Dahlia Lithwick herself speaking, but it attests to the tone of reporting and commentary on the Supreme Court to which she has contributed. A tone that invites us to observe the court as informed insiders, insiders whose attitude towards the court is sort of like that of a close friend or family member, but one that we respect. On the other hand, you know them so well that you have a certain level of insight into and can sometimes even anticipate what they're likely to say and do. Dahlia Lithwick's work, I think, walks a fine line between, in covering the court that makes for enjoyable reading, but is also valuable to our democratic structure. On the one hand, she maintains respect for the court as an institution and the justices in their official capacity. And she offers us analysis of the court's work that I think is really unparalleled, cuts through the legal jargon and gets to the core. At the same time, she acknowledges the justices' individuality, their judicial temperaments, their idiosyncrasies. And it's just that touch of irreverence that actually reassures us that the justices, and by extension the court, are real people. And they're not so far removed from us that they become not part of the citizenry as a whole. The presence of these dual perspectives, that respect for the court and this touch of irreverence, I think reaffirms our respect for the court and its work, but reminds us that the justices are not infallible and they're not autonomous, that the person does not disappear when the black robe is donned. So the end result of this work is that the Supreme Court, that very far away and remote third part of our government, actually becomes more accessible to ordinary citizens. And surely that is an important function in a democracy. With that, Ms. Dahlia Lithwick.
Well, that was about the nicest introduction I've ever had. Thank you so much, Palma. Congratulations to Steve. Thank you, Creighton, for having me here. And the snow is awesome. I thought that was over for me, but apparently not. I'm going to talk a little bit about covering the Supreme Court. Believe it or not, this is my 12th year covering the Supreme Court, and I'm still, by like 30 years, the youngest person on the press corps. It's a press corps that really stays forever. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between the court and the Supreme Court press corps and how it's changed. And then I think I'm going to end by talking about things that I'm worried about with regard to those changes, things that I see happening if we don't rethink this relationship, which is a very, very fraught and complicated one. And then I'm going to just leave lots and lots of time for questions. So I want to start with the premise, and I think Professor Strand sort of flicked at this in her introduction of me. I want to start with the slightly strange precatory idea that the Supreme Court, unlike other branches of government, is actually two completely different institutions in one, and that it requires a certain suspension of disbelief to acknowledge that it is two things at the same time. It has always been two things at the same time, and I think the press has always colluded with the court in giving the impression that it's okay, that it's two completely irreconcilable institutions at the exact same time. So on the one hand, you have an institution that is completely political, quite partisan. Justices are appointed by presidents, partisan presidents for partisan reasons, with partisan aspirations for the court. These are strategic actors who are acting strategically, and they work, as you can see in recent years, towards certain partisan political ends, ideological ends. And so you get a lot of 5-4 decisions because it is a political institution. But at the same time, the court is different. It is the one institution of the three branches of government that aspires to be more than just that, that wants to transcend the idea of being purely political. It is, I think, for all intents and purposes, the secular church of this country, hence the big marble building and the black robes and the red velvet curtain. I think it aspires to be the closest thing that we have in America to an oracular institution that doesn't change, that divines certain fundamental truths from the closest thing we have to a founding biblical document, which is the Constitution. And so it is both these things. It's both political and transcends politics. It's both made of human actors who behave strategically, but also made of people who I think for the most part are doing their level best to be more than just politicians in robes. And it's a very, very complicated thing for both the court, for the American public, and particularly for those of us who cover the court to hold on to those two ideas simultaneously, because quite obviously they're in conflict with each other, in tension with each other all the time. So I think that it's in the court's interest, and it's always been in the court's interest, to sell that second narrative. We're different. We're not political. What we do always transcends politics. What we do is special. That's why we get this job for life. And I think it's in the press corps' interest to sell that narrative too, because otherwise we're just covering Congress. If we're just covering a purely political, ideological body, what's the point in reading all those footnotes? So we really like to say, and I do think we collude with the court, to pretty programmatically sell that narrative that the court transcends pure politics. Why? Well, because the legitimacy of the entire institution depends on the American belief that it's not just a political body. And the best evidence I have for this anxiety is Justice Stephen Breyer, who just put out a book, a thick, impenetrable book, called Making Our Democracy Work. And in order to sell the idea that the court is not a political institution, he went on Larry King Live on CNN, PBS NewsHour and Charlie Rose, NPR's Fresh Air and Morning Edition, ABC's Good Morning America, NBC Nightly News, C-SPAN, and had major interviews in, among other things, The New Yorker, The Associated Press, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Bloomberg. And he went out on every platform and media format he could in order to sell one simple message, this was his talking point, and it is the predicate idea of the book. The court has neither the power of the purse nor the sword. It should not have any public legitimacy. It didn't for a long time. And yet now the public supports the court, even when the public is critical of the court. The public supports even unpopular opinions. Why? Because, says Stephen Breyer, on every single network that has someone who will listen to him, because, says Stephen Breyer, what justices are not is 9 junior varsity politicians. And that's his soundbite, and he says it over and over again. So it's incredibly important to the justices to make this point in every way they can, that they are not ideologues, they are not political, that they're all friends, that at the end of the day, they agree on virtually everything because what they're really at work doing is divining this Constitution. And I think that there's 2 ways in which the media has helped promote this idea that the court really does transcend politics almost all the time. One is, I think, a good thing. That is that the media calls them out when they fail to do that. So the media is never more critical of the court than when the court behaves in a partisan or ideological way. But the media also, I think, colludes to treat them like oracles. The media colludes overwhelmingly, and by the media I mean the Supreme Court press corps, to be very, very gentle with them, to cover them as though they are not people, to cover them as though the people part of their job is not interesting, the political part of their job is not interesting. What we really, really like to do on the Supreme Court press corps is cover the law. So the premise that I'm going to share with you today is that I think that is breaking down. What's breaking down at both ends of this bargain, both on the media end and the court end, is this idea that the court is different and special and we should treat them as such. And I think that we're in for a disaster if we don't fix it. So I'm going to just make 4 observations. I'm going to talk about changes in the media that I have seen very, very quickly in the last couple of years and the changes in the way we cover the court. I'm going to talk about the way the court has changed its relationship with the Supreme Court press corps in the last couple of years in good and bad ways. Then I want to talk about changes in the way the public in general views the court and how the court has changed its relationship with the public. And then I want to end by saying that I think it's starting to affect the way that the court views the public. And I think that it's starting to affect the way the court thinks about doctrine, particularly First Amendment doctrine, and I think it's something we want to be very, very wary of. So I want to start with the proposition that, as is the case with all close and intimate relationships, the relationship between the United States Supreme Court and the press corps that covers it, and remember, there's only about 30 or 40 of us on that press corps. It is a tiny press corps. And as I said, we're lifers there. People don't leave this beat. And like all close and intimate relationships, this is a relationship that is profoundly dysfunctional. The court sort of works on the proposition that they loathe and do not need us. And we also work from the proposition that they loathe and do not need us. And somehow it works out generally really well to the court's advantage. This is not a new thing. Chief Justice John Marshall famously said, "Oh, I can't be bothered to read the newspaper. The newspaper doesn't matter to me. It doesn't affect me at all," at the same time that he was anonymously penning long screeds to be published in newspapers. So the court has always both read the newspapers, cared about the newspapers, tried to manipulate the media, and then pretended that to be completely above public opinion and what the world thinks. So I want to talk a little bit about how the media has changed, the way we cover the court has changed. Because as I've said, I think it's always been a very, very fraught and complicated relationship. I think that reporters who cover the court have always done the same two things we do now. So those who suggest that the Supreme Court press corps is harsher than it used to be, I think that's incorrect. I think we've always been inclined to attack both justices and opinions. And I think that the justices have always felt that this is a profoundly unfair relationship because they can't talk back. And the days of them writing long anonymous screeds in which they talk back are over. I think they feel that they're trapped in a conversation where they write an opinion and then we yell at them and they can't yell back. And I think that creates a certain imbalance that's very frustrating. But the court has always been absolutely dependent on the media to get their message out. And again, quoting then Chief Justice John Marshall, he said, quote, "The court lacks any legitimate means of ingratiating itself with the people." This was just a failure on the part of a court. They don't have press conferences. They don't have ways to explain themselves, and they rely on the press to do it for them. And in fact, before there was a government printing office, which didn't come about until 1860, the court had to rely on the press to get opinions out at their expense. The court had to pay to get opinions out. So they were completely reliant on the press. And this created an insane imbalance. It's always been there. Now, Chief Justice Marshall was so careful about one thing, and that was promoting this narrative, the second narrative that I'm describing, which is that the court is apolitical. And he did that in all sorts of ways. He did that by encouraging the justices to write per curiam, very, very few dissents. He wanted the court to speak as the court. That's a tradition that existed decades later until very recently. If you got a court transcript of oral argument, it didn't say, Rehnquist says this. It said, the court said this. This is all really harkens back to an era where the court wanted to be perceived as nine big brains in a vat that were all one person. There were no 9 individual justices, and the idea that the court spoke as a court really, I think, is attributed to the 30-some-year career of Marshall, who was very, very, very worried about public legitimacy and the idea that the court not be perceived as just a partisan political institution. Now, the Supreme Court press corps has really, I think, agreed to those values, to the values that the court speaks as one voice. We are a very scholarly press corps. We love nothing more than to read briefs. When we've read the briefs, we read them again. If you catch us in the press room, we're talking about the briefs. If there's some scandal, there's very rarely a scandal, but if there is a scandal, we don't want to talk about it. We really do cover, my line about the court has always been that the Supreme Court press corps covers the court as though the law were alive and the justices are dead. And what's really fabulously interesting to us coming out of oral argument, and it could be an oral argument in which Justices Scalia and Alito all but poked each other in the eye with their thumbs. They were so angry. But we come out and say, oh my God, did you see what happened to the Dormant Commerce Clause today? So this is what we cover. This is what's exciting to us. And it does mean that we tend to elide over the personalities, we elide over the conflict. It also means, I think, that we're one of the last press corps that's really sort of wonky and principled and not interested in gossip and scandal at all. You may have noticed that when Ginny Thomas called Anita Hill at 7 in the morning a few months ago, there were very, very few Supreme Court reporters who weighed in on that. Because that kind of dispute, that kind of titillating gossip, most of us see as just absolutely beneath us. So what's changed? I think a few things have changed. I think that there has been a shift, and this came with the advent of the, quote, new journalism in the 1960s and 70s. 1979, the Brethren comes out. Woodward and Armstrong take this position, this very adversarial position with the court, where they say, we're going to really scrutinize public officials. We're not going to treat them with kid gloves anymore. We're going to sort of discomfit the comfortable, and we're going to really focus on the politics of the court. And that was a huge shift. But I want to suggest to you it was an aberration. Because for the most part, post the Brethren, we don't cover the court in the manner of Bernstein, of Woodward and Armstrong. We cover the court in the manner of Linda Greenhouse, someone who I think has, in her 30-year Pulitzer Prize-winning career, really been just most interested in covering the law and covering doctrine, and quite uninterested in scandal and gossip and what motivates and what the politics are of the various justices. So there's a couple of other things that have changed, and this is just how my job has changed. I used to come out of oral argument at noon, and everybody was scrambling to write because they had to write for the morning paper the next day. And that meant they could go and have a 3-hour lunch and still make their deadlines. We come out of the court at noon now, out of oral argument, and we're expected to have something online within 2 hours. We're expected to blog it. The really unlucky ones are expected to tweet it. If you're at Slate, they hope you're making a slideshow of it. We're supposed to be having live chats and podcasts, and by tomorrow morning, the time in which it used to be the case under the normal news cycle that America was consuming its news about the Supreme Court, it's way too late. It's way too late. Nobody wants to read about the court the next day. So we have no news cycle. We've got this completely compressed news cycle, which means that everyone's working too fast. We make a lot more mistakes than we used to. I think the other big change that I've seen on my beat at the court, is really the death of long-form journalism. 1,200 words is absolutely the longest people will read. That number gets smaller every year. And that there isn't the sort of long, thinky, I've had four months to digest this opinion, and here's what I think about it piece. Occasionally you can still get it in the Times Magazine. You can still get it in the New Republic. But for the most part, with the death of 5,000 words, very, very thoughtful, reflective pieces about the law and the court, we tend to be focused on everything that I think is bad for the court, which is conflict, gossip, personality, drama. We're competing. We're in a news industry where we're now competing not with other publications, but with other writers. And there's a real impulse to do things quickly, not necessarily well, and then to move on to the next thing for tomorrow. And I don't need to belabor this point. I think it's fairly obvious. But if there's an institution that is disserved by speed and recklessness and a focus on gossip and a shift away from fact to opinion, that institution has got to be the U.S. Supreme Court, which puts a value on everything that is not that. That puts a value on going slowly and being meticulous and focusing on fact as opposed to opinion. So that's a real tension, and it's a tension that I've seen really explode in the last few years. And I think there's an enormous anxiety, not just among the justices at the Supreme Court, but among judges in general, about the decline of the media or the perceived decline of the media. The sense that the guy who covers trials in my courtroom this week covered, baseball games last week and is going to be the weather girl next week. That there's no sense anymore of professionalization in the media, and that people don't know things, and that they're racing to meet deadlines, and that as the industry collapses, the one thing that is really being most harmed is the courts. Now, I don't want to sound all gloomy about changes in the media, because I think that there are some things that have been fantastic that the new media has brought to coverage of the court, not the least of which is the advent of the legal blog, having Jack Balkin and Eugene Volokh and Doug Berman opining about opinions the minute they come down is something that is absolutely indispensable. It also creates huge anxiety in the press corps, because if Jack Balkin can do it and he's written treatises, why do people want to read us? It also, I think, has really, really enabled us to use links and primary sources and primary documents in ways that are critically important, so that I don't have to say, here's what the Heller opinion says. I can link to it. And presumably Americans can go read it, and that is critically important for me to be able to do my job. And the other thing that we've had to do to accommodate the fact that we work too fast and that we have very, very short deadlines and that we're having to get our copy in a quarter of the time we used to, is we've become pretty good about admitting our errors. And I think the transparency in the media, at least at Slate, I have to say we've done a really good job of just being very, very honest about the fact that if you work this quickly, there's going to be mistakes. But I think that the court has also changed its relationship with the Supreme Court press corps. And I think a lot of it is a function of this anxiety I'm describing to you. That if all these hooligans are going to stand here and bludgeon their way into court and then make mistakes and then focus on personality and on conflict, the court's going to obviously be discomfited by that. And so I think post the Brethren, there's been a real clampdown on clerks talking to the media, on justices talking to the media. There's been a huge clampdown on leaks. I think that there are no scoops to come from the justices anymore, and this is a big, big change. You can hang out with justices for years and years, and they won't tell you anything. And if you get access, if you get to sit in their chambers for the coveted 45-minute interview that is supposed to make your career, I promise you what you will talk about for 45 minutes is the window treatments. You will talk about, look at this nice artwork and look at this potted plant. This came from Arizona. What do you think? There's just not the relationship, I think, that there used to be where justices would offer just great tidbits of information that you could parlay into a story. Those days are just gone. And the best evidence I have to prove that to you is that all of the justices, including retired justices, cooperated with Jan Greenberg and Jeff Toobin in their major, major books about the court 2 years ago, and there were almost no scoops. There was almost no surprises to be found in either of those two books, because the days of the justices dishing, I think, are long gone. I think the other thing that has really changed at the court is that they've tried to be more accessible about things like putting names on the transcripts of oral arguments. I think they tried to be very, very accessible about getting transcripts out earlier in the day. It used to be that you had to wait days and if not a week to get a transcript. Now you can get a transcript of the argument the same day. One of the things that I think tells me that the court is stressed out about this access is their audio policy. Because it used to be the case, starting with Bush v. Gore, that you could get access to same-day audio at the Supreme Court, at least in the big 4 or 5 blockbuster cases of the year. And so the oral argument would end at 11, and at 11:05, C-SPAN would broadcast, or NPR would broadcast that day's oral argument. You could really hear it. It was extraordinary. And people like me would pick up clips and put it in our copy, and it was really, I think, opened the court up and said, well, you can't see them, but at least you can hear them. And listen, this is what it sounds like. And that went on for about 10 years, and a lot of reporters said, this is awesome, can we have them for all the cases and not just the 4 or 5 big cases? And people like me said, it's a huge mistake if you're trying to sell the narrative that you're unanimous most of the time and you don't disagree and you're not partisan, to only provide same-day audio on the guns case, the affirmative action case, the abortion case, and the church-state case, where you're all going to scream at each other and sound like partisans. So let's do audio every day for every case and show the world that what you do is, in fact, the narrative you want them to believe. You listen very hard to each other and you divine what the Constitution says. Instead, we got an audio policy that began this year that was an attempt to give us what we wanted. We get them now. Does anyone know? Friday afternoon at 5. We get the week's audio. Friday afternoon at 5 is where the news goes to die. There is nothing any of us can do with audio, live audio of the week's cases when it comes in at Friday afternoon at 5. And I think it's a way of the court simultaneously giving us what we asked for. Okay, we're going to have a fair, even-handed audio policy, and giving us something that nobody can use for anything. So I think it's an example of this anxiety. We want to let the sunlight in. We want to let people hear what we do, but we're going to give it to you in a way that absolutely no one can consume it or use it. And I think the other thing that's really happened, and this is also, I think, a terrific source of anxiety for the justices, is there's no more private spaces anymore. So it used to be the case that if Justice Scalia got up to give a speech, he would say there will be no audio recordings here, and there would be no audio recordings there. Now it is the case that when most of the justices get up to say something somewhere, someone is tweeting it, or someone is blogging it, or someone writes about it. And there's no way anymore for them to say, we're off the record. They're always on the record. And some of, I think, the really uncomfortable gotcha moments that have happened between the media and the court in the last couple of years have arisen because someone just gets in one of the justices' face with a camera or with a video, and there's no way to stop it. But more profoundly, I think, and this was really a problem a few years ago where Justice Sandra Day O'Connor gave a speech in Europe, and it was reported that she said certain things that were quite inflammatory about threats to the court and to her safety, and then there was no transcript and no record. And it became her word against the reporter who reported it out. So it seems to me that the opposite of what's going on now, which is we're off the record, we're off the books, nobody's going to know about this, you're always on the book. You're always on the record. There are no private spaces, and so it seems to me the best thing the justices can do to mitigate the sense of gotcha out there is to always be public. And I know that sounds terrible and threatening, and I know they hate it, but I think the presumption that we can go places and it's not going to get out what we say or what we do, I think in the era of the new media, that's over. So if I'm right, that the court has really denied us access to them doing the thing they do best, which is their work, which is oral argument. Where are the ways that Americans get their ideas about what the court does? And here I think this is the nut of the problem for me. I think there are two ways that Americans get their ideas about the Supreme Court, and these are not things that the Supreme Court press corps has any control over them. One of them is the phenomenon, the rise of the celebrity justice, and the other is the confirmations process. And neither of those have anything to do with the work of the court. So I don't think it bears even really belaboring this point that through all of the 1950s and all of the 1960s, only 2 justices ever went on television. Between 2006 and today, every single justice has gone on TV. Every single justice cooperated with C-SPAN for a series about the court. Every single justice cooperated with Jan Crawford Greenberg and Jeff Toobin with their books. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote a tell-all autobiography, the likes of which no one had ever seen from a sitting justice. Justice Breyer, as I noted, has done so much television that it's amazing to me that he has time to do his work, and has gone on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me to be the great winner of Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me on NPR. Every single justice now understands that if they want to be in the conversation with the public about the courts, the way they should do that is go on television and give an interview. Now, some of that makes perfect sense. Some of that is reaction to Chief Justice John Roberts and his rather astonishing, good, high-quality conversation about the law that he had at his confirmation hearing. And I think after that, a lot of the justices looked around and said, wait, I could tell America about my view of constitutional jurisprudence. I just need to, get in the makeup chair and I could do this. And so then we had really a long series of Justice Ginsburg, Justice Breyer, virtually everyone except David Souter, who I think still, would hide under his desk when there were cameras in the building. But with the exception of David Souter, I think most of the justices in the last 7 or 8 years have just made their peace with going on television and telling their stories. Here's Justice Scalia on C-SPAN in 2008 explaining why it is that he has learned to love the thing that he hates, which is television. Quote, "That's one reason I've sort of come out of the closet in recent months, and I've done a lot more interviews and allowed my talks to be televised, more than I did formerly. I've just sort of come to the conclusion that the old common law tradition of judges who don't make public spectacles of themselves and hide in the grass has just broken down. It's no use. I'm going to be a public spectacle whether I come out of the closet or not." So he's sort of saying, I guess I'd rather be a public spectacle and be in control of my public image. And so out they go on television. There was an amazing version of this that I witnessed 2 years ago, where Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was then the only woman sitting on the Supreme Court, was very, very affronted by the conduct of the male justices in a strip search case that had to do with the strip search of a little 14-year-old girl. And that justices, I think, the male justices just affronted her because they likened it to, you know, changing in the locker room for Jim and how bad could it be. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was so annoyed that she, while the case was still pending, gave an interview to Joan Biskupic at USA Today and said, "Holy cow, we need more women on the court. These guys have no clue what it's like to be a 14-year-old girl." And depending on whether you thought it was appropriate or not that she felt that way, it was certainly a moment in which the power of one justice to use the media to make a point was very much in evidence. And it won't surprise you, those of you who don't know it, that this case came out 8-1 in support of the 14-year-old girl. Justices who, coming out of that oral argument, looked very, very skeptical about the idea that there was something wrong with this strip search, completely changed their view, I think because when Justice Ginsburg called them out in the pages of a newspaper, it was humiliating. And I think there is this sense that public opinion matters, so we want to be in on the conversation. So the other part of this that I think is even more worrisome than judges giving interviews and one-on-ones and writing tell-all books is the confirmation process, which I don't think I have to tell you has nothing to do with justice, nothing to do with justices, nothing to do with the Supreme Court. I don't know what it has anything to do with. It looks like something my kids watch on the Cartoon Network. Every year when I have to, for the past 2 years, when I've had to cover these confirmation hearings, I just keep saying to myself, oh my God, can't we do it some other, could we use darts? Is there some way to do this that is less excruciating, that doesn't make the court look stupid, the Senate look stupid, and the nominee look like a big liar? Because no one nets out to their benefit from this process. But I think Americans get an awful lot of their ideas from the confirmation process. And if you don't believe what I said at the beginning, that Supreme Court reporters want nothing to do with this, let me be perfectly clear that we don't cover the confirmation hearings. Our political reporters do at most papers, because it has nothing to do with the law. And so we opt out. The justices or the nominees, for the most part, opt out. They just sit there and try to say as little as possible. And I think with the exception of Chief Justice Roberts, who really used it to effectively message a version of his version of minimalism and humility and calling balls and strikes, I think most of them come out from that process with two really negative outcomes. One, the view that the American public had of them is sealed in amber at that moment. So the Americans still think that the Clarence Thomas they met at his confirmation hearing is the Clarence Thomas of today. That's not correct. The Sonia Sotomayor that you may or may not have met if you tuned into C-SPAN is not the Sonia Sotomayor who's on the bench today. So we have these very artificial ideas of who these folks are. But, and this is the really poignant part, I think the justices come out quite damaged from this process. I think that they don't always understand, and this is the difference between the Marshall Court and the justices of today, is that it used to be the case for a long time that people came to the bench after a long and storied career in politics, and they understood that it's theater, and that we're just Punch and Judy, and we bonk each other on the head, and then we fling our arms around each other, and we go out for dinner. I don't think judges who've been on the appeals court for decades know that. I don't think they've ever been treated that way. And I think when somebody calls Samuel Alito a racist to his face in front of his wife, or somebody suggests that Sonia Sotomayor is a racist and a genderist racist at the same time, to her face, I think you come away from that process quite scarred. I don't think you ever quite recover from being really humiliated and embarrassed for days and days and days. And recall, the idea of the confirmation hearing as a public TV spectacle is quite new. I'm not suggesting that they were always cakewalks. Justice Brandeis had a horrible hearing. Thurgood Marshall had a horrible hearing. And they were racist and they were offensive in all the ways that I've just described. But they weren't public television spectacles. And if there was somebody you could say, I will never forgive, It was the senator who asked the offensive question. Today, I think there are an awful lot of justices who say, the person I can never forgive is everyone out there, all the people behind the Klieg lights who let me stand up here and be humiliated. And if I'm right, and I do think I'm right, that Clarence Thomas has never, ever forgiven this country for how he was treated at his confirmation hearings, that Samuel Alito has never forgiven us for how he felt he was treated at his confirmation hearings, then we have a real problem in this country, because they turn around and use this experience, which was, in fairness, humiliating and damaging, and they use it to evaluate the press, and they use it to evaluate the public. This is their one and only experience with being out there in front of the public, and it's awful. And so I want to close these remarks by saying that I think if the court refuses to let us in at their best moments, at their moments when they really are being bipartisan and above the law, they're really grappling with hard issues, they're deferring to each other and thinking hard and doing what justices do most of the time, my sort of original narrative, the court as something that transcends pure politics. If they lock us out of that, and then the only alternatives we have where the press has a relationship with the court are either these really awkward television moments, these interviews where they talk about their moms and their furniture, or these horrible, horrible confirmation hearings, which are bruising to everyone involved, then the only message the American public is getting about the Supreme Court is that other narrative, the political one, the one that says this is about people who are strategic, making ideological decisions. And I feel that the court has made the worst set of choices in terms of their policies, because by not allowing the television cameras into oral argument, they're saying, in effect, judge us based on this hearing. And that can't be in anybody's interest. And here's where I think it's really worrisome. There has been a real shift at the court, and it's early days, and so maybe I'm reading too much into this. But I think one of the most fascinating splits that I've witnessed in the last year at the Supreme Court has been a split between Justice Samuel Alito and Justice Scalia. And it comes down to these issues of the public and civility and the media. And time and again, you see this fight play out. I think between justices who are comfortable with the idea of the public and justices who are really fundamentally threatened and worried about it. So this little series of data points that I want to just quickly track for you begins with the Prop 8 hearing, where there's some talk about the California Prop 8 initiative being televised for a handful of courthouses in California. And the court races in last winter and issues a per curiam and unsigned opinion that unplugs the cameras for that Prop 8 hearing. And the language that is used is the language of the public is threatening, the public is frightening, the public is the kind of people who are going to terrorize witnesses, and if the public can watch this trial, nobody will come testify. It's the language that we don't generally in this country, having had years and years of experience of cameras in courtrooms in state courts and in lower federal courts. We know this isn't right. This doesn't sound to me like justices talking about the public witnessing a trial. This sounds to me like justices mapping their experience of the media onto their doctrine about access to the courts. We see it again in the spring in Doe v. Reed. This is an amazing Washington State ballot initiative case where people who sign a ballot initiative there's an all but gay marriage law, and they want to get it off the books, and people who sign the ballot initiative want their names protected. And Washington State sunshine laws say, no, you sign, a ballot initiative, you're legislating, and your name is out there. And again, you see Alito and you see Thomas at oral argument, incredibly anxious. People's names will get out there. They're going to get harassed in their homes. One of the people who spearheaded this initiative had to hide his children in his living room because he was so afraid of them being next to the windows. the real anxiety that you hear from Alito and Thomas about the public and about the internet and how the internet changes everything. And there's language in Justice Thomas's dissent in this case that it more or less says anyone whose name is out on the internet now will be subject to harassment and violation. Again, I don't know if that's true. I think that is about a deep, deep sense that the internet changes everything. And at oral argument, you have this amazing breakdown between Justices Alito and Scalia, where Scalia is standing there and more or less thumping his chest saying, civic courage. You know, if you can't have the courage of your convictions, don't go out and sign ballot petitions. You know, there are laws about harassment, and if someone comes and knocks over your mailbox because they don't like your ideas, you can get them on some other law. But you put your name out there. You be brave. We didn't even have secret elections in this country until recently. And here's, again, Justices Scalia and Thomas, and often in these cases, Justice Breyer making the point that this is different. The internet is different. Television is different. And all of this really comes to a head this fall when the court hears the Phelps funeral protest case, which is an incredibly amazing thing to witness for 1,000 reasons, not the least of which is Fred Phelps' daughter, Marjorie Phelps, arguing in front of a bunch of justices who would love to punch her in the mouth because she's so awful. But over and above that, this same amazing split begins to materialize on the court, where Justices Alito and Thomas and Breyer are trying to say, the internet is different. Don't you understand? We live in a different time. People are scary, and they want to come and hurt you. And Justices Kagan and Sotomayor and Scalia, who just don't have any of that anxiety about the public, about the press, about new media. And the amazing split really, I think, comes into full bloom, if I'm right about this, in the violent video games case this fall, where Justices Alito and Scalia, who agree on virtually everything, devolve into an argument about what James Madison would think about Mortal Kombat. Why? Because in Justice Alito's view, technology and the media are dangerous, and they're terrifying, and they're leading us to be violent and hurtful. And in Justice Scalia's view, we thought this about comic books. We thought this about newspapers. The public and the media are protected, and they should be protected in all of their forms. So my conclusion before I take questions is this. Maybe if it is the case that the confirmations process and the ways that we talk about the court in very, very partisan and political ways in that process, if they are affecting the justices and in turn affecting the way the justices look at us, what role does the media have to play in this? And it seems to me that the Supreme Court media is best serving the court if the court helps us let the public in when the court is not doing partisan work, when the court is doing the work that I think it is supposed to be doing, which is the work of oral argument. I think so many of these problems go away if the court allows video cameras day after day so that we can watch them work. Because I think right now we're in a vicious cycle, and I think it's cycling out of control. I think that the more we get locked out of oral argument, the more the public becomes focused on the gotcha moments, on the confirmation hearings, and on the silly, trivial interviews. And I think the more the public becomes focused on those partisan visions of the court, the more the court mistrusts the public. And so we loop around again. And I want to conclude by telling you that I think it's just not an accident that the year that all this started to burble up at the court, this anxiety about the press and the public, was the year that for the first time in its history, the Supreme Court locked the front doors. And the main front doors at the court, the ones that say equal justice under law, are now locked, and the public has to go in the side doors. And part of the reason for that was stated at the time as, there's just some unspecified sense of threat. But I think that the threat is us, and I don't think we've changed. I think what's really changed is that we're in this very oppositional and unhealthy relationship between the court, the media, and the public. And I think if we can't rethink from the ground up how we cover the court and how the court talks back to us, this prospect of being locked out, quite literally locked out, is only going to get worse. So those are my thoughts, and I'm happy to take any questions. Does anyone want to respond or react? Or we could just talk about Ginny Thomas calling Anita Hill? Yep. Did people hear the question, or shall I repeat it? Did you hear? Oh, nodding, repeat, or nodding, I heard? Okay, I'm just getting lots of affirmatives. Good. I'm going to take that to mean that I need not repeat the question. The question was just briefly, isn't this extreme partisanship partly playing out in the media as well? Is that fair? Yes. I have two responses. One is the media has always been unbelievably partisan. There was a brief time in the 19th century where the media stopped being our newspaper and your newspaper. One of the things that's interesting, if you go back and you read the coverage of the Dred Scott decision, was it looks an awful lot like the coverage of Citizens United, which is that if you believe that it was a correct decision, the media was like, what a fine piece of narrow, humble, strict construction, close reading of the Constitution. If you didn't like it, you thought it was just rampant judicial activism, ends-oriented partisanship. So I think it's always been the case that the media was quite partisan, and then I think we got used to a time in which the media tried to be not that. But I think your underlying question is right, which is the media is right now absolutely split. We have two realities in this country, and it's quite funny to me because people complain that they only want the facts and they don't want partisan media, and yet everybody watches either Fox or MSNBC, and poor CNN in the middle, who's trying to just report the facts, has an infinitesimal viewership. So I think when we say we only want the facts in America, we might only want our facts. We might be at a time now where we really think that this incredibly partisan media is somehow fair as long as we listen to our media. But certainly I do think that it's the case that the commentary about the court, and this has risen up with the blogosphere largely, has been very, very partisan. There's no question about it. And I think that same impulse has infected the confirmation process, which means that a process where it used to take you 3 hours and they would do it on the papers now takes 5 days, and it's fueled, and this started in the Bork era, by multi-million-dollar campaigns, by interest groups who have a dog in this fight, and that is new, and that all contributes to politicizing the court. I think the one place that I might push back a little on the question is, I think at the same time right now, if Americans wanted to have access to the transcripts, they could get it. So there is an openness now that we've never had before. We never had anything like the Volokh conspiracy or balkanization, these incredible blogs by legal professors that are thoughtful and fair and nuanced, and even if they're slightly politically leaning one way or another, we had nothing like that in this country. And so I think it really is sort of my Dickensian answer is it is both the worst of times and the best of times. I think the caliber of what is good in talking about the court is better than it has ever been. We've never had anything like this. the caliber of what is bad is really bad and partisan. But it seems to me that there's two issues, and one is, what do Americans want to consume? And I do think that in the end of the day, I mean, my story is always the day that I had the most calls from TV bookers in my entire 12-year history of covering the court was not Bush v. Gore and not Heller. It was the Anna Nicole Smith appeal. And you can bet that when I got on that show, those shows, they didn't want to talk about, inheritance law. They wanted to talk about Anna. So we are completely celebrity-driven and gossip-driven, and that is a huge problem. And for that, I can't make apologies. But I will say, I think that what's good and smart and fair and balanced in talking about the court is better than it's ever been. Anyone else? Yeah. I can't see, so yeah. I think he didn't know. I mean, I think this goes to, if you believe what I said about, people who've been on the appeals court for years and years just don't get it, what happens in front of a camera. I don't think that Justice Alito had any idea that when he was saying, that's not true, that we were going to watch that 12 million times after. I suspect he wouldn't have done it if he had really been thinking, wow, I'm miming at the president. So I think he didn't anticipate that, but I think that's a really good example of ways in which the court there was a very real prospect going into this year's State of the Union. And as a direct result of last year when President Obama did criticize the court, and he criticized the court very specifically about Citizens United. And in addition to Alito being upset, Chief Justice Roberts said in two speeches after that he doesn't much care to go anymore. He described it as a partisan pep rally. There was a very real possibility going into the State of the Union this year that the court's 4 liberals and 1 moderate would be there, and the court's entire conservative wing would not. Because Scalia hasn't gone in years, Thomas hasn't gone in years, and Alito made very plain he wasn't going to be there. And when the Chief Justice went, I think there was a huge sigh of, okay, we're not a 5-4 court, we're something else. But I think the State of the Union is another really good example where either all the justices have to go or none of the justices have to go. But sending the justices who like president is really the worst possible signal you can send to the American people, particularly if, as I said initially, this is the only glimpse the American people are going to get of the justices that year. And sort of seeing like all the women in their frilly collars, and Kennedy and Breyer sitting there, and then seeing none of the court's conservatives there, I think absolutely reinforces the idea that this is a partisan and ideological court. So it seems to me we've got to make a decision. It's in the court's interest to make a decision to either all go or not go at all. And I would say, by the way, the same thing about the Red Mass that they go to in the fall, that there's just a very, very partisan split now. And I think the justices need to understand that when they kind of show up en masse for things, they really need to speak as one voice, because the idea that the liberals do one thing and the conservatives do another is so very damaging. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that the State of the Union really kind of dovetails with what I'm saying here, which is it gives off the worst possible version of the narrative that the court is purely political. I felt like I saw a hand. Yeah. Well, we've got, okay, why don't you go first? That's okay. Go ahead. I think it's the latter. I mean, I think that the court is a bipartisan, above politics, different institution, except when it's not. And I think that it's an incredibly partisan, ideological, fractious body, except when it's not. And I think that both those things are true for all the reasons you said, because justices are human, and because they are, in the end, I think, very influenced by their own politics and policy preferences. And so I think it's impossible to completely separate your goals, your political and policy goals, from your opinion writing. And I think they do their level best to separate it much of the time. But it seems to me that even the notion that what justices do is umpiring, and they just call balls and strikes, and they're basically just, a super robot with good shoes, that can't be right. I mean, we know that's not right. There has to be something else at play. I think one of the really interesting things that I've watched playing out is as this notion that justices are just umpires and they're purely and mechanically applying the law. Oh, and by the way, doing that is really easy because the Constitution is simple and straightforward if you just read it with the right glasses on. I think that the rise of that story, and I think this was really the great success of Chief Justice Roberts' confirmation hearing, is that story is so attractive to everybody that now you hear that story on the left of the court and on the right of the court. In other words, when Sonia Sotomayor, who was primed by President Obama, he was going to fight the umpire narrative. He was going to say something else has to happen and something else should happen. And the word that Obama chose, you may recall, was empathy. And when Obama put that word out there and said, here, I'm going to use this as a crowbar for progressive justices to talk about liberal judicial values. And you all remember what happened when Sonia Sotomayor was asked if she espoused empathy. No, I'm an umpire. I'm even more of an umpire than the last guy. I don't believe in empathy at all. So I think that there's two problems. One is that narrative has so taken hold of our imagination because that is a narrative of constraint. It's the story of, the alternative to being just humble and minimalist and narrow is that you just make stuff up. And that can't be right either. And so I think that the utter failure to talk about the court on the left and the right in this country in anything other than what I think is a pretty cartoonish version of what jurists do, the idea that that's so taken hold that everybody gets up at their confirmation hearings and parrots. Yeah, I actually have no opinions or thoughts or feelings or preferences or really ideas at all. I'm just pretty much a robot. I think that can't be serving the court either. So I think if you're going to take the position that you need smart and passionate and creative and thoughtful people to be on the Supreme Court, we need to have space for them to explain why they are thoughtful and passionate and smart and creative and not why they are, in fact, an android. So we skipped, yeah. I mean, that's certainly the argument that is used against allowing cameras in, is that it will embarrass the justices. It's going to create Jon Stewart moments, right, where every single night Jon Stewart is going to actually give up on American politics and only embarrass Justice Scalia for 30 minutes. I think that's going to get really old very fast. I think 2 of those Scalia episodes would be enough for the American public, and then they would want to go back to John Boehner. So I guess that all the arguments that I have heard for not allowing cameras in the court, and by the way, I think some of the most interesting testimony, again, I think just makes the point I've tried to lay out for you, some of the most interesting testimony about why we shouldn't allow cameras in comes from Clarence Thomas testifying before the Senate. And he says, we're not safe. I mean, for him, it's not a question of how the court looks. It's literally a question of threatened and perceived harm to the justices. And I think conflating those issues is really problematic. But I think as to the question that the justices will be embarrassed, it seems to me that what's happening now is embarrassing. They are still being filtered. They're just being filtered by us. They're still being quoted in snippets and sound bites. They're just having it done by us. So it is not the case that the American public is getting raw, unfiltered access to the justices. What they're getting is me interpreting it. And it seems to me that a better idea than having me interpret it or having Adam Liptak interpret it or Joan Biskupek is to have the American public just see it. And on the question of will the justices change the way they behave, my fervent hope is that they do, because, I think that oral argument is not always the justices acting at their best. And I think that if they were being scrutinized, they might behave slightly better. And my third response on this is the Canadian Supreme Court has had cameras in the court for decades. And all of the harms that are supposed to come about have not. In other words, lawyers don't act like monkeys. The justices don't ask foolish questions. There's, nobody streaks by in front of the cameras. It's not a football game. It is, the court conducts itself in a very, very thoughtful and respectful manner, and advocates who for the first 2 days were a little weirded out by cameras got over it. So I just don't think that the arguments about, the O.J. Simpson factor really work. I think they work for 2 days, and then people normalize it. And then the American people who have to stand in a line in the freezing cold in the hope that they can get in and watch their government do its work can actually sit at home and watch their government do its work. I mean, I just think as a democratic matter, and I guess this goes to Professor Strand's point too, we need to be able to see the court at work. There is no excuse. At the very least, we should be looking at this using a strict scrutiny test, not the justices just don't like it test. And it seems to me there's no good argument for prohibiting cameras, and so many really compelling ones for letting them in. I think I can take one more, if there's anybody. Who? Yeah. Oh, now we got two. It's a really good question, and it's what Justice Scalia often says. Is he says, what we do is really hard. It's hard, and it's complicated, and all of the things you're trying to do to make it easier, in fact, distort what we've done. And my answer is, what they're doing is being distorted anyway. It's being distorted on the op-ed pages. It's being distorted in the blogosphere. So it just seems to me that the idea that the days where the American public doesn't care about the court, those days are gone. The American public cares passionately about the court. It's whether they're going to get good information or bad information. And it seems to me that the choice to give them raw, undistilled, unfiltered information more often than not has to be the right decision. And I don't disagree with the premise that this isn't like describing a PTA meeting. This is complicated. It's nuanced. It's never simple. But I think that it's lazy to say we can't do it. And I think the American public really does want to know what the court does all day. And one of the reasons the American public is deeply suspicious of what the court does all day is because they don't let us into their house to see. And they could. And I just want to conclude with one point that I probably should have made earlier, which is to the extent the justices think that going on 60 Minutes and going on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me demystifies the court, weirdly, it has the opposite effect, so that when you look at public opinion polling about the justices, the ones who we trust the least in this country are the ones who are out stumping and doing the most speeches and being the most public. So I think that the American public, and this I think goes back to your question about, the American public is so aspirational about the court. We really want umpires. We want them to be better than human. And when they show us that they're human in an effort to allay our fears, we're like, they're human. I could do this. My dog could do this. And so I really want to close with the idea, with the same idea that I gave you, which is both are true. They're human and they're political, but they're also better than that. And I think that anything that we can do to hold them to the part of it that is be better than that is something we should be doing. Thank you. You've been very patient. Have a good evening.
I just have, I'm supposed to, we have a little gift that I just want to give to Dahlia because we so much appreciate her coming. It's a book of Omaha and Nebraska.
Thank you so much.